Hey y'all, welcome back to Twin Oaks Family Farm in rural southeast Ohio, USA. We have a small poultry operation that includes raising chickens for meat production. I bet you can take one look at what's on the back of this flatbed truck and have a pretty good idea what we're getting ready for. Welcome back. I'm Melissa and I am so glad that you're here. We are getting ready to start meat chickens again very soon. It is actually February 25th, 2025 as we're recording this. We have meat birds that will move in on March 12th, 2025. We're planning on 225 Cornish rock cross meat chickens that will be in production for poultry. And as of now, February 25th, before we even start birds on March 12th and before we finish them, I think their finish date is April 23rd. We know that most of the poultry from this flock that we're fixing to raise is already spoken for on reservations and pre-orders from clients right around us in our local area. Now, if we didn't raise the meat birds for offering the poultry to consumers, we would probably still choose to raise this kind of meat bird, Cornish rock cross meat chickens, for our own household poultry consumption, but we would do it on a much smaller scale. Even as it is, we're very small scale, but certainly bigger numbers than we would raise if we were just producing them for ourselves. In 2024, we raised 1,650 Cornish rock cross meat chickens, and in 2025, we are scheduled to raise 1,300. We would have actually started with 100 a little bit earlier in January for a total of 1,400 over the year, but we decided to actually cancel that flock, and we were able to coordinate that with hatchery and with our processor because we had record cold that time of the year this year, and it is a challenge to manage ambient conditions for meat birds. And as we saw the forecast developing, we made that change of plans about 3 weeks ahead of time, and we just decided we didn't want to deal with the super cold temperatures. So one little tip before we look at what's behind me and talk about this for a moment: if you're raising meat chickens for your own household consumption, one of the tips we would advise is raise them during a time of year when the ambient conditions in your climate are naturally as close to the ambient conditions that your meat birds want for success and to be able to thrive. We find that meat birds, when you start them as little hatchlings, do best at about a 95-degree Fahrenheit ambient temperature, and then it drops about 5 degrees each week through their production till you get to ambient conditions of about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and then that's pretty much where the birds want to be. They can tolerate down to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit in the warm months of the year very easily, but that range is pretty much the temperature range you want. If you could start meat birds when it's 95 and finish meat birds when it's 65, that would be awesome. That's the ideal temperature ranges we want to work with. So it only takes about 6 weeks to start, grow, and finish the Cornish rock cross meat chicken variety. And we're in Southeast Ohio, so like we know from experience, our best window for raising meat chickens is basically late August to the beginning of October. That's when, if we could raise all the meat birds in that 6 or 8 week span, that's when we would do it. So I started out showing you what's on the flatbed. We're going to do just a series of videos here starting 2025 to talk about the steps we take to get ready for meat birds, and the items on the flatbed truck today are what we're talking about. So I said you probably only need one look at this to know what we're getting ready to do. I've already revealed that we're getting ready to raise meat birds, but what you're looking at here are our supplies for feeding and watering the meat bird hatchlings. So we prefer these baby feeder trays. I call them the baby feeder trays. So this is the bottom of one, and each one has a top. And I know y'all are familiar with these if you've raised birds in the past. So they will fasten together where they'll hinge together, and then this lid is like a flip top, but we have them all taken apart because we cleaned everything, and we actually will start the birds with just the bases of the trays. Okay, so I went ahead and put one together here. So obviously you can see the flip top feature if you're not familiar with them. And when our birds get to about 3-4 days old, we will put all of these lids back onto the little feeders. But when we initially start the birds, we don't have the lids on. We just start with the bases of the trays, and we fill them to the top with their starter chick feed. We also use these 1 gallon waters. So that's the reservoir for the water, and it fits onto these bases. Okay. So actually when you use them, if you're familiar with them, you know that you have to fill the reservoir and then put the base on it upside down. That screws down, and then once it's secured, you can flip that over. So I went ahead and screwed that base on, and then when it's filled, you can flip it over like that, and the water gravity feeds into that little tray there, and that holds about 1 gallon. So one of the major things we do when getting ready for our meat chickens to move in is to make sure that we have the baby chick feeders and the baby chick waters, that we have them cleaned up and ready to be in use, and that we have enough quantity for the number of birds that we're starting. So that actually is all of the baby chick waters and baby chick feeders that we have here. We have about 20 of the feeders and about 20 of the waters, and we expect to use them all when we have a flock of about 400. So we, at any given time, if we're raising birds in production, our production system is basically set up for anywhere from 100 to 450 birds all at the same time. So this is one of the things that's a real important priority before our birds move in, is just making sure that we have these feeders and waters on hand, cleaned up, ready to be put into use right away. And we do recommend these. Now, if you have a bigger operation and you want to have everything set up like automated, there are wonderful automated feed systems, automated water systems that you can set up in your building and make a permanent infrastructure. But in our case, behind me is the meat bird barn where we raise the meat birds. We don't want it to be a permanent infrastructure because I mentioned it only takes us about 6 weeks to start, grow, and finish them. So we may only raise 5 or 6 flocks in a year. So even at 6 flocks, that's 6 weeks per flock times 6 flocks, that's only 36 weeks. It's not the entire 52 weeks of the year. When the building isn't in use for birds, then we want to be able to use it for other purposes. So we don't want infrastructure of water systems and feed systems and those lines in the building that we would have to work around. In fact, if we could have got to where we were only doing like 3 or 4 flocks a year, that would even be our preference, again, because of the ambient conditions, because then we could slide all that production down into parts of the year when the weather is more amicable to the conditions that the birds want. But as it is, we have to work with what we have. So as this little bit of a series goes on, we'll talk about the other supplies that we have ready, the other consumables that we want to have ready. We'll talk about being ready in the building for the birds. But a good first step, if you've got to get ready for chickens ahead of time, have the feeders and waters that they need to get started. And then we'll at some point also show you the feeders and waters that we will move these birds into, because this will only take care of them part of the time. They're actually going to outgrow these. In our experience and for our preferences with our meat birds, we find that we only keep them in these baby feeders and baby waters probably about 10 days. Definitely by day 14, we want to have them out of these and shifted over onto some bigger supplies. So the last thing I want to say about the feeders and waters, even with the baby ones, and at all ages and stages, and even when we transition into the bigger feeders and waters, but even starting with these, you want to make sure that you have enough quantity of these for the number of birds that you're going to raise. So what you need to do basically is just keep it really simple. Just envision the amount of birds that can fit around a 1-gallon water. How many of our little chicks can fit around that? Well, on day one, quite a few chicks can probably fit around that. Probably 8 to 10 chicks plus could fit around this on day one. But by day 7, those chicks are going to have grown a lot. When we're talking about meat chickens, they grow super fast. So like by day 7, we're only going to maybe see 5 or 6 chicks fit comfortably around a feeder like that, and or a water like that, pardon me. And how about our feeder? How many chicks are going to fit around this? Chicks can line up on both sides of it when it's filled with feed. So on day 1, you could probably see 20 chicks eating out of this. But on day 7, it's not going to accommodate 20 chicks. How many chicks is it going to accommodate on day 7? I don't know, but it's going to be less than it did on day 1. But that's basically, you basically want to think about how many birds can access these supplies all at the same time. And then make sure that you have enough of these supplies so that, here's the rule of thumb. Does it always happen this way? No, but the rule of thumb is make sure you have enough feeder space and enough water space that if all the birds decided to go eat at the same time, or all the birds decided to go get water at the same time, that we can supply that. Now, in practice, in reality, quite frequently, especially as the birds get into the grow phase and the finish phase for meat birds, we typically don't necessarily have enough space at the feeders for all the birds at one time, or enough space at the waters for all the birds at one time. But we want to have ample space at the feeders and waters throughout production so that the birds aren't struggling to get to food or water when they want it, so that they're not fighting each other to get to food or water when they want it, and so they're not stepping over top of each other. We want there to be ample space at the feeders and at the waters for them to go there without having to force their way in. So that's what you'll want to think about whenever you are getting your supplies for your baby chicks. So for a start, first step, know how many chicks you're going to have, and then accordingly get enough feeders and waters. These are examples of ones you can start chicks with to start your chicks off and give them a great start. You always want them to have fresh water, and especially with meat chickens, it's critical that they have food in front of them. We give them food all the time, but if you're going to choose a different feed schedule, it's critical that they have feed in front of them most of the time. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you have questions about raising meat chickens. I'm more than happy to try to answer them, maybe even try to do a video on what you bring up, and we will keep y'all posted on the steps we're taking to get ready for the birds and on the chicks when they actually move in. So we're doing our countdown in 2025 to meat birds getting here, and we are starting with having our feeders and waters ready to go. They've been cleaned and they're ready to go. Okay, y'all, so a little bonus material before we cut the video. Thanks for joining us. Wanted to also mention before we totally wrap it up, what about cleaning them? These are supplies that we've had for years. They've been used flock after flock. Do we take extraordinary measures to clean them? Do we do anything extra special? Honestly, no, we don't. Now, you can take the cleaning and sanitizing of the feeders and waters to whatever extent you want to. Do what makes you confident that they're ready to go. Do what makes you comfortable with having them ready to use and then reuse if you're going to use them from one flock to another. But honestly, all we've done with those was I dipped them in a bucket of clean water. I had a scrub brush, manually scrubbed all of the surfaces, top and bottom, inside and outside of the water reservoirs, the 1-gallon tubs, and then dipped them in another bucket of clean water, and then set everything up here on the flatbed pickup truck to air dry in the sunlight. We are comfortable and confident with having just cleaned them, scrubbed them, rinsed them, and let them air dry in the sun, that they are clean, sanitized, and ready to go for our next flock. But absolutely, if you prefer to use a cleaning solution, that is perfectly fine. Do what makes you confident that you are ready to go. Just make sure that you've cleaned the debris off of them and that they've had some form of sanitization. We rely on the sunlight and the air drying, and we're good to go with these. So Just clean them up between flocks and they'll be good to use again.